So you have your household disposable income. So that's for those that are employed. And now I'm talking about the working class families. So those are the poor, or what they say is the the poor and the working class families. So they have their household disposable income. So from that household disposable income, there are certain variables that put pressure on the income. For instance, you have debt. So you find that the income that they generate or accumulate at the end of a pay cycle, let's say a month, does not necessarily reach towards the next pay cycle. So then that means then it is consumed and finished somewhere, let's say mid-month, or sometimes even before you reach mid-month. So then the household then is forced to go and get debt. So usually this household are eligible just for unsecured debt. So that would be your personal loans in the form of credit cards, overdraft, short-term loans. And that's just from your formal institutions, because I say from your formal institutions on the basis that you'd find that the average in South Africa is that for every 1 rand generated, 77 cents of that 1 rand goes towards servicing debt. But then that's just formal institutions. Then when you add Umashonisa, when you add your neighbors, your friends, and so forth and so on, obviously then it's more than 77% that goes towards servicing debt. So now that puts pressure on that household, because now once they get their pay for the next cycle, that means they first have to pay off those debts. And then that is why, again, they can't reach the next month or the next pay cycle. So that's just one. So that's debt. And then secondly, you go to your CPI, which is your consumer price index, headline CPI, or inflation for short. And then we headline, you would then add your food prices and your fuel prices. So because they spend most of their income on food than any other thing. So then you find that, let's say this year, in May, the CPI was 5.2%, and then in June, and 5.2% was a 30-month high, by the way. And then in June, it was 4.9%. So why does this then become important in terms of analyzing this household disposable income? It's because, first, if you look in between 2020, 27 March, when lockdown began in South Africa up until now, what has happened is that most people have not received in increments in their salaries. Some people, their salaries have been reduced. Some people have their salaries remaining same. Or those that have not received increments, obviously they remain same. Some have been terminated and some have been reduced. But then everything else in the economy, or the expenses, have went up. So now if everything goes up and your salary is reduced, terminated, or remains same, obviously it puts pressure on that salary, because you have to now maximize it. But then there's so many endogenous pressures exogenous pressures that you don't even know what to do. So then that's why CPI then becomes one variable as well that we use in the analysis of the pressures of household income. Then we'll go towards now unemployment. How does unemployment affect an employed individual? So you find that the category of people that we're talking about, the poor and working class households, they work mostly in your labor intensive sectors of the economy. So when you work in labor intensive sectors of the economy, that means that this is just a side note. When there's lockdown, there's no production, then you sit at home. That's just for noting. But then what's important is that usually those sectors of the economy, they require low-skilled workers, and at most it's semi-skilled workers, but it's usually low-skilled workers. Now, what then happens is that because you are low-skilled, the rate of replacement becomes high. You can be easily replaced. For example, if I were to talk about someone who packs food in a grocery store, anyone can pack food in the economy. The most typical example I like using is this one of the restaurant sector in South Africa, where you find that because when you go to work, you are selling your labor. And whatever you get as an income is what your labor is valued for. So now when these things happen, your CPI go up and so forth, and you have these pressures that you have to deal with. So now what you then do is that you would want to approach your employer and say, employer, I have these issues. Is it possible for you to give me an increment in my income? And then your employer, obviously, most of the time, because you're low skilled, and you know low skilled people are not taken serious, even their rights in most time are abused. So your employer can give you options. Hey, you are not going to get an increment, but then your employer can go as far as to say, I will replace you, because it's easy to replace you. So your employer can replace you with someone that will do the same amount of work for the same pay and not complain. Your employer can replace you with someone that will do the same amount of work for a lower pay and not complain. your employer will replace you with someone who can do more work with the same amount or a lesser amount and not complain. And we have seen this play out in the restaurant sector, where now, because employers, remember, they don't care about you, they want to maximize income. So then now, in order to maximize income, they want to cut their labor costs. And now they go outside, even outside the country, like we've seen in the restaurant sector, where there would be complaints from South Africans that Zimbabweans have taken over the sector. It's because Zimbabweans are very competitive when it comes to income. So that means they can take lesser income than what South Africans can take. And therefore, they squeeze them out because they compete aggressively, and they squeeze out the South African and they get into the sector. So now that's what happens. That's just a high level example as to now when there's so much high unemployment in the country. So that means your bargaining power as the employed, if you're a low skilled worker, gets eroded rapidly because you can easily be replaced. That's one. Two is that the more people get unemployed, that means the few that are employed have to carry those people. So that means then that's why you'll find that on average in South Africa, one income, one salary would carry about or support 4 people. So that's the person that generates the income and probably 3 dependents. But then that is the average of South Africa. So as you move to this class that I'm talking about, obviously the average is higher. And we have seen it in townships, whereas Uthola there's umama who works and then has to take care of her children and their children as well, because her children, adult children, cannot find work, but then they reproduce, and then now she has to carry all that burden on her shoulders, or that one income stream or that one income has to carry all these people. So now the more then there's unemployment in the economy, the more people lose jobs. That means the few that work have to carry everyone else who is unemployed. So that puts a serious pressure on that household disposable income. And then the last one, because you can have so many variables to it, but then the last one is that the savings. So you find that these households, it's from hand to mouth. So they can't generate savings on the basis that there's no surplus. As I said, it links to the debt. So they have debt that they have to pay, and then they still have to take more debt in order to carry out the month. So then they do not generate any surplus, so they can't save. So because they can't save, they don't have what you call financial or buffers, meaning there is nothing that will absorb shocks that come towards them. So for instance, when let's say there's lockdown, and now because of lockdown and this opening, closing, it causes your cost push, demand pull, inflation, or inflation, let's say, goes up. They cannot tap into their savings to supplement these increments in the economy. They don't have. So now the lack of surplus or the lack of savings puts more pressure on these households as opposed to the top 1% who have investments. So when things don't go well, they can easily tap onto that investment to supplement their income. So then there is a buffer. So they can then absorb the shocks that come to their households. This group cannot, because they live from hand to mouth. So now I've tried to explain the challenges or pressures that come on household income because of debt, because of inflation, because of unemployment. And this unemployment, you must know also, in South Africa, it's cyclical in nature, like what we are seeing now. Whereas if the economy is going down, then the demand for employment also goes down with it. And then that means then unemployment goes up. It is structural because we're talking about this group that is semi-skilled. So we can hear that there are jobs, but they do not have the skills in order to get those jobs, regardless of the fact that there is a Skills Development Act, a skills development levy, a skills development plan. Maybe we'll talk about that later, because those are the solutions that are there, but they're not being implemented. So then these are the pressures. That is the household income, and that's why it's bad for them. Basically, what we have, when it comes to underemployment, we start here. According to the International Labour Organization, to properly analyze labor market deficiencies, you do not look at this binary that is always looked at, which is employment and unemployment, but you also look at underemployment. So that's for proper analysis. So underemployment has these components which then make up the definition. I will just go through over some. So you have your underutilization of skills. For example, what I have seen, I will not mention that bank, where they would get someone who has a master's in a STEM qualification, but then they would use that person to probably just work in a branch of the bank, whereas that qualification and what the person is doing, obvious that person, their skills are not properly being utilized, even though it's in the economy that says they require such skills. But that's just an example of underutilization of skill. So that person is underused, and then that person works at less than full time or regular employment. For example, that person is, if you are on a learnership, if you are on an internship, you are not working full time, like there are no guarantees. Or maybe you would like to work your work on contract, whereas you should be permanent, what we normally see, that you are given a contract that gets renewed and so forth. That's one component as well. And you also an underpaid. So that means then whatever the market related salary is, you are earning below that market related salary. But because of the desperation, because of unemployment and the desperation, you are forced to continue. So now then with underemployment, then comes up a second thing, which comes from underemployment, another component of underemployment, which is employment filtering, which is what I said earlier. So for instance, I think you would realize that even in the SAPS, for example, when they recruit these days, they will recruit graduates, people who have a post-matric qualification. Banks, they do that as well. So that means those people are still doing the same job that those with matric used to do 5 years ago, earning the same income. So they're performing the same duties for the same income, but they are more skilled for that position. So that is employment filtering. So what happens over time is that it becomes a norm. And then a norm in a sense that they would say now, in order to be a policeman in South Africa, you now need an honors qualification, honors degree, because over time it becomes, so that is employment filtering, which is a component again of underemployment. So where do we see this underemployment play out in the main? It plays out in the main for your graduates, because you would normally see from even statistics, every quarterly labor force survey, you'd find that from the highest education level, you'd always find degree or graduate to be up 8%, 9%, but it's always lower than these other education levels, on the basis that that cohort is more susceptible to underemployment. So they would get a job because of the qualification they have, but then they will not be fully employed. So that is why their numbers are so low. That is why you find it scary. Whereas there are about 1.5 million graduates that are sitting at home. We have 1.2 million students registered in our universities, but that's just unemployment for those. And then over time, remember, when you are sitting at home as a graduate, you become desperate. So I've studied economics, I have a master's in economics, but I'm not getting a job that is related to my qualifications. So over time, I become desperate. Then when someone says that, okay, fine, you have a master's, I will make you an administrative assistant, I am most likely to take the job out of desperation, but then I am overqualified for that skill. So then I become underemployed. And what happens is that now a person that has that skill set to perform those duties, I have pushed them out of the labor market as well. So they can't enter now because I have entered and I'm not supposed to be there. And now these things happen because our economy does not give me space for me to enter and also do what I have studied for. So that then becomes underemployment, and that is why underemployment is critical. Even when I engage, when universities collect their statistics, they would say their exit level surveys, they do not look at underemployment. So you'd find that the university would boast that 90%, 80% of our graduates get employed after, I don't know, 6 months of graduation, 12 months of graduation. That is because those graduates are underemployed. So they do get absorbed in the labor market, but then the roles that they play in the labor market are not what they studied for. So they are doing less jobs. I can make a lot of examples, but I have friends who are now security guards with degrees, or who have more skills than that, they are underemployed. I have friends who are working at banks as tellers, with a master's in statistics, master's in applied mathematics, master's in computer sciences, and so forth. Those people are underemployed. And now it robs the economy, because we do generate and produce these skills, but the inability to have proper pathways because we call them pathways, to say one pathway is unemployment, one pathway is employment, one pathway is entrepreneurship, one pathway is underemployment, and so forth and so on. So without having proper pathways for these people, they end up in places, or we call them end destinations, where they're not supposed to be, and they close other people out of the economy, and the economy cannot fully now exploit their skills in order to grow. That's why we've always argued, some of us, that you find that the government spends about 450 on average thousand to produce one graduate, for that person to go and be a packer at a retail store. And then now you see, Gucci, the investment our government makes, the output of it, and so forth, there's no alignment. So it's a wasteful expenditure in a way. So I was trying to just give a very short summary with a lot of examples of how underemployment is problematic. But in our economy, people would be say, just be happy that you have a job, because a lot of people out there are unemployed. So unfortunately, that's how it is. So you take whatever you can get and you become underemployed.